Growing up, how much of this free colonial history did you actually get taught?
Suffice to say, none at all. If you're raised in the Philippines itself, it just feels like background. And over here, it can feel like a missing piece you didn't know you were looking for. Same history, but there's like a different hunger for it. Of course, grief is actually a sign you understand what was taken.
We're not here to be angry, and we're definitely not here to tear anything down. Not the faith, not anyone's family story. We're here to hand something back. That's it. That's the mission. And the plan going forward is simple. Every history video we release, we follow with a conversation like this one. Something deeper, more personal. A place to actually talk. So, let me bring you in my guest. My first ever guest is actually someone who already works behind the scenes here at the Heritage Pinoy Talks. Our intern and honestly our resident history expert. He's a political science major at UC Berkeley. Everyone, this is my son, Gerald Fryren.
Thanks, Mom. It's always a bit surreal being on the front end of this whole operation, given I'm usually more technically oriented and operate in the background. But pleasure to be here.
Okay, so people are meeting you for the first time. Tell them, how did you end up at the Heritage Pinoy Talks?
Well, of course, you raised me, and being from a half Filipino background, I entirely grew up in the American context, meaning like you try to inculcate me certain values and remind me of the roots. But distance is a hard thing to overcome. But as I've grown now, especially being fascinated with history, I would say I've been interested in this project as it relates to how history intersects with my own identity and others.
And you're studying political science at Berkeley. So where did this history of the session come from?
Well, like all young boys, I would think it started with military history. I was a little bit into like World War One and Two, the tanks, the planes, the guns.
And I remember that
Yeah,
when we were younger.
yeah. But as I grew older and matured, the horizon of what became interested also expanded. So now, again, generally, I'm just interested in how history relates to people's identity, in particular, well, for the purpose of this podcast, Filipino identity, and how that relates to history.
Okay, let me ask you the one I ask everybody. Growing up, how much of this free colonial history did you actually get taught?
Suffice to say, none at all.
And what's one thing you wish every Filipino kid learned?
Well, going through higher education and knowing about pre-Spanish colonization history, I would say to every Filipino kid that, again, there is a whole culture and really world of understanding that existed before Spanish colonialism, and I feel like it would be important for them to understand who they were before Spanish colonization.
Okay, Gerald, I want to hand you the floor. Let me start where you live. As a pol sci student, what actually makes something a state, and did these pre-colonial kingdoms qualify?
Well, the definition of a state is simply defined by the fact that there's a people that live within a inhabited boundary defined by borders. That the Filipino kingdoms that existed before Spanish colonization do meet that benchmark.
Okay. Here's the one I love. Butuan sent envoys to China and demanded to be received as equals of Champa, a bigger, richer kingdom. What does that tell you about how they saw themselves?
Well, from my understanding of your question, I would presume that they somewhat existed on the periphery of local affairs, but they also were a rising power, hence why they went to China themselves to get that recognition and be recognized as equals of the Champa.
And so much of what we know survives only in Chinese and Spanish records. A rival empire basically filed the paperwork proving we existed. What do you make of that?
Well, that indicates that the Philippines, with the onset of Spanish colonization, lost these systems of writing as well as like paperwork and stuff that generally proved Filipinos existed as an identity before Spanish colonization. That it just indicates that they were purposely suppressed.
So whose history survives and whose disappears? And what the sides say?
So there's like this tendency in pop history to say that history is written by the victors. And while I will concede in like the very much layman average person understanding this is somewhat true, but with academia, of course, this course is changing. Rather, it's like the history still exists, but for one reason or another, it's just not properly utilized and put out into the public square. But with like stuff like public education, higher education, you can see how that influence and that new narrative is starting to take shape within the public discourse.
Last one here. What's the difference between a history being lost and a history being left out?
That's a good question. I would say the difference as to history being lost, that's when you have either incomplete or very little records to work with from that time period. And so while you can maybe piece together like an incomplete picture, you'd have to somehow speculate on what is like not there. So you have to fill in the blanks, which can be helpful sometimes, but is also inaccurate. A forgotten history, is that my understanding? Forgotten?
A history that got lost and history that got left off.
Oh, left out. That in terms of history being left out, the history obviously is still there, but for some reason or another, like it's just not properly known. And it's the job of academics and people in higher education to make sure that that history that's unknown for now gets out to the public so everyone else can know.
All right, Gerald, let me pull us into the present for a second because you think about this stuff. A lot of this old history was about the sea, trade routes, ships, ports. Does any of that connect to what's happening now?
I would say very much so, because of current ongoing situations in the world. The Philippines has been experiencing a energy shock just because it imports a lot of its energy. So the Philippines and the sea being interconnected, I think, is very relevant. There's also the issue of Chinese encroachment onto Filipino territory. Now, a benefit of today's world that there's this capacity for other island nations to get together, whether that be Indonesia, Taiwan, maybe even Vietnam, through like multilateral institutions such as ASEAN. They could leverage the potential resources of being island nations as a counterweight to Chinese encroachment.
To keep the trade open and free, right?
Yes.
Okay, great. There's also this whole conversation about artifacts, our gold, our heritage pieces sitting in museums overseas.
Well, ultimately, if the artifacts are Filipino in origin, then ultimately, again, they should be owned by the Filipino people and thus the government. That's not to say, however, that they should solely remain in Filipino museums. I am all for, of course, cultural exchange. People can learn about the Philippines in other museums around the world as these artifacts get shifted around, and then they can appreciate Filipino culture, and we can retain our pride and dignity from afar.
Right? What about language revival? Baybayin, our own script. Is that meaningful or mostly symbolic?
Both. So it gives a sense of dignity and pride, but also it's symbolic because it shows a reclamation of what has been lost and, of course, brought into the present.
All right. So, and you're a Philan at Berkeley. Does knowing this history change anything for young Philams?
Yeah, so speaking for myself, I don't feel that way, but I'd say for other Filipino Americans, I'd say definitely yes. In terms of how that history relates to their identity and how they want to interact with it, yes, it plays a very important role.
Okay, I want to put something on the table because I think it's honest. The videos on this channel are made with AI. The host, a lot of the art, some of the narration, and Gerald. You care a lot about getting history right. So I actually want your honest take, the good and the parts that bug you.
Well, AI is a tool like any other. It has its proper uses and context. What I would strongly advise, though, is that you use AI to aid you in the telling of a story. Because since it's a new developing technology, it can get details somewhat wrong or somewhat distorted. But humans, like this would not be possible, this whole podcast we're having right now, if it weren't for AI. So I am also aware how it allows people at like the individual level to tell these stories. But one must have due diligence and make sure that while using AI, it's still historically accurate, whether that be in a portraying a particular period, portraying particular items, all of that. I would I would be okay with AI visualizing and making, but with a human ultimately reviewing it and ensuring it's accurate. And just to be clear, we're again depicting real ancestors, real places, real culture. So I would say these are sacred things, and there's a sacred responsibility to make sure that they're portrayed accurately.
So, where's the line for you? When does it serve the history and when does it hurt it?
Hmm. Yeah, it's like a tough question. It helps to portray in a visual form a truth, but again, it needs safeguards. So, like, you have to do the research yourself to ensure that this is all done correctly. But again, verify what it produces in the use of making this content.
And that's actually a nice bridge because the episode we're about to talk about was made exactly this way. So let's get into it. All right, let's turn to the history itself. The episode made the case. I want to sit in it with you. The whole premise of the episode is that we were taught our story starts in the wrong place. As a pol sci person, why would a curriculum start at 1521? Who does that serve?
Well, this comes from a predominantly Western centric telling of the story. Of course, the Philippines is named after a Spanish king, for one. And because of that colonization, it stems from that particular reason.
And who was that king?
King Philip.
Okay, got it. So is that a Spanish thing, an American thing, or something we kept doing to ourselves?
Well, there's a bit of complicity in everyone involved. Of course, Spain, in the course of colonization, wanted to tell its own story, not the Philippines. And of course, in the American colonial period before independence, it was convenient for America to make use of these colonial mentalities and slogans. And then to the extent today, current Filipino education is just a bit lackluster for whichever reason or another. And what's great, though, is that we're trying to correct this deficiency.
Something I feel watching this. It's two things at once. Pride in what was here and this grief for what got lost. Do you feel both?
I would I would say yeah overall, and I don't think you have to pick. The pride is real. We had gold, law, systems of government, and set senses of identity. But of course, there's this genuine loss too, because we barely use these ways that we had before Spanish colonization now. And I think it's okay to grieve with that loss. Of course, grief is actually a sign you understand what was taken.
But how do we hold the pride without it turning into a fantasy like everything before Spanish was perfect?
Well, that's the issue of threading the needle here, right? These were real human societies. They were not perfect. They, of course, had to deal with problems like any other society across the world. But what's important is that these are our own societies and histories and identities to grapple with, not ones dictated and issued upon us by foreign peoples.
All right, for a lot of our audience, people who grew up abroad, this history is almost like identity infrastructure. As a film, what does it change to learn your people were sailors and goldsmiths and lawmakers, not somebody's discovery?
Okay. It definitely gives a sense of permanence to your own sense of identity, of course, for a lot of people, especially for those that are diaspora. There's like a unsureness in your own identity because while you're originally from a certain place, you don't fully belong here, but at the same time if you go back, you're not really sure if you belong there either. But with the being equipped with this knowledge of history, it makes people like me and others connected to this whole region. And that's a good thing to carry, especially far from home. It carries a sense of dignity and pride.
Okay, do you think someone raised in the Philippines carries it differently than someone raised over here in the US?
Yeah, I would say so. Because but if you're raised in the Philippines itself, it just feels like background. And over here, it can feel like a missing piece you didn't know you were looking for. Same history, but there's like a different hunger for it.
Now, this era has some real debates in it, and I want people to see how you actually think through them. Can we do a couple?
Let's do it.
Lapu-Lapu, every so often, someone insists he was from the south. A Tausu, not a Bisaya from Mactan. How do you weigh that?
So I'd say the way you handle is that historians rank sources. The only eyewitness account that we have is from 1521 is Pigafetta. He sailed with Magellan and he places Lapu-Lapu on Mactan in the Visayas and records Visayan words. That's a primary source written at the time. The Tausug version mostly comes from genealogies written down centuries later. Those aren't worthless, but a story written 300 years after the fact doesn't outweigh an eyewitness. That's why the National Historical Commission says he was a Mactuan chieftain. You go with the stronger evidence. And so, of course, you can see here my lack of growing up in the Philippines is really showing.
It's totally understandable. Okay, so here's what I know you feel strongly about. The Code of Kalantiaw. We deliberately left it out of the episode. Why?
Because it's a forgery, to be honest. For years it was taught as this ancient Filipino legal code, but it was actually invented in 1913 and a historian named William Henry Scott basically proved it was all made up. And here's the thing. It's tempting to keep it because of the great story and it makes us look advanced and all that. But if we lean on a fake to prove we had law, we hand every skeptic a reason to dismiss the real evidence. Leaving out the good fake is how you protect the real stuff, like the Laguna copper plate, which actually is real.
Such a good point. The honesty is the credibility.
Exactly. And it's the same with the small stuff. Geography, for example. People will say people will say something like, Surigao is in Bicol. It's not. It's in Mindanao. It sounds minor, but if you get the map wrong, you give people a reason to doubt everything else you said. Precision is to be found in trust.
Okay, last big one. If you can send this channel after one piece of the world before 1521, what would it be?
Ooh, honestly, I'd go for the Babaylon. The spiritual leaders, often women, who held the community's beliefs and healing, so much of that got erased. And it tells you who we were on the inside, not just what we traded. Though a close second is Babayin, our own script. There's something powerful about a people writing in their own hand, I would say.
Why that one? What would it give people back?
Primarily, a sense of lineage and history and connection to the past. Because, of course, you could argue that written language itself is like a form of immortality translated from the past into the future. And so you could see how that really has an effect on one's own perception of identity and history.
Gerald, thank you. This was exactly the conversation I hope we'd have. If you haven't watched the episode this goes with Magellan Didn't Discover the Philippines, go watch it. It's linked. And subscribe to the podcast because we're just getting started. And here's a question I want to leave you with. The one Gerald and I were just chewing on. The Babaylon, Baybayin, or the Lost Songs. Which should we go after first? Tell us in the comments. We read them. You did not begin as somebody's discovery. See you in the next one.